Since the dawn of civilization, plague has been one of the most significant drivers of demographic, political, and socio-economic change in the ancient, medieval, and modern world. While much is known about the historical significance of plague outbreaks, the exact nature and origin of the disease has been shrouded in mystery, leading to intense debate about what kind of disease caused the major historical waves of plague. One of the most notorious examples of plague is the Black Death, which struck Europe between 1347 and 1353, marking the beginning of successive plague outbreaks into the late 18th century. The Black Death was the second plague pandemic. The first plague pandemic beforehand was Justinian's plague, which struck the Mediterranean region from 541 to 740, named after Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The third plague pandemic took place in the 19th century, concentrated in China. This video essay will argue in favour of the established view espoused by Ologé Benedicto, which primarily attributes the second pandemic to the bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Recently, some scholars have challenged this explanation by providing alternative causes. Graham Trigg argues it was likely anthrax. Susan Scott and Christopher Duncan question if it was even a bacterium, identifying it as a hemorrhagic disease caused by a virus similar to Ebola. Debate centres on how plague spread, particularly the role of rats and the interpretation of recorded symptoms. Alternative theories are often based upon a misinterpretation concerning the absence of dead rats in contemporary accounts. Analysis of the third pandemic is essential to understanding the second pandemic. This is because it was during the third pandemic that scientists were able to collect empirical data, which is not possible for the second. Shibesaru, Kit Asato, and Alexandru Yersin isolated the pathogen, hence its name, Yersinia pestis. The Indian Plague Research Commission, the IPRC, gathered a variety of scientific data. Crucially, they established the role of rats. An infected rat population, an epizootic, would die in proximity to humans. Their fleas, through starvation, latched onto humans, passing on the disease. Key to this is the presence of bacteria in the blood, known as bacteremia. Human plague victims frequently did not develop bacteremia. Contrastingly, rats typically developed bacteremia, with levels up to 1,000 times of the average in humans. Therefore, humans were poor sources of infection. Effective transmission relied on fleas, vomiting blood due to blockages within their ventricular system. In this role as a vector, Xenosciopis, a rat flea, is the most successful. Usually, pathogens become weaker over time to maintain the host's life for transmission via natural selection. However, blockages formed more readily with the most virulent forms of Yersinia pestis, the most likely to cause death. Crucially, this means Yersinia pestis has likely changed very little since 1348, meaning the similarity of symptoms between the second and third pandemics indicates they shared the same cause. Throughout history, plague has been most associated with the appearance of swellings. A contemporary account by Gabriel de Musis recorded swellings in the armpit or groin at Kaffa in 1347, the city from which the plague entered Europe. Giovanni Boccaccio also recorded this in Florence in 1348, which the inhabitants named Gavioculi. These were known as buboes, as a physician recorded during the 1721 outbreak in Marseille. Evagrius Scholasticus wrote about his affliction with these during the 6th century amidst the first pandemic, Justinian's plague. Medical officers in 1900 also reported the occurrence of pus when cutting into buboes during the third pandemic. Similarly, the accumulation of pus occurred during the second pandemic, with numerous supposed cures revolving on its removal, including lancing. These symptoms are consistent with the bubonic plague caused by a Yersinia pestis infection of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the system by which fluid from tissues is drained and then returned to the blood, which is essential to the function of the immune system. Lymph fluid containing the bacterium exudes to the nearest lymph nodes, in which Yersinia pestis can rapidly multiply, resulting in inflammation. These lymph nodes are concentrated in the armpit and groin. The recently discovered ability of Yersinia pestis to exploit buboes by infecting monocytic cells to disseminate intracellular bacteria, speeding up pathogenesis, the process by which a disease progresses, can explain the plague's extensive effects on the body. During the London Plague of 1665 to 1666, royal orders recognised carbuncles, blains, and spots as the usual symptoms of plague, alongside buboes. These skin complaints also indicate Yersinia pestis infection. The association of buboes with imminent death is of particular significance. A French friar recalled that in 1348 the buboes presented an infallible sign of death. Likewise, they indicated guaranteed death in Florence. In later stages, blotches on the skin appeared like in London in 1666. Significantly, there are sources which mention spewing of blood and swift death, which also suggest the presence of pneumonic and septicemic forms of plague infection, pointing towards Yersinia pestis. However, symptoms of the bubonic form of the disease are far more prevalent. Critics of the traditional view, like Samuel K. Cohn, emphasize buboes are not exclusively caused by Yersinia pestis. They can develop during other diseases, notably typhus, malaria, and glandular fever. Cohn makes a valid point in noting that during the 14th century, buboes were observed in greater numbers than modern plagues. Additionally, chroniclers reported them in non-glandular areas, such as the face or arms. In 1900, only 2 out of 38 cases in a Glasgow hospital possessed more than one bubo, with no sign of spots propagating across the body. Contrastingly, the medieval chronicler Boccaccio wrote that the gaviculio spread and would spread at random all over the body. The frailty of Europe's 14th century population provides a possible explanation for this. Famine prevailed in many preceding years, particularly an intense European-wide famine during 1315 to 1317. Compounding this was the Great Bovine Pestilence across Europe from 1315, which reached Ireland by 1321. From 1319 to 1320, the bovine cattle population of England and Wales fell by over 60%. Unlike grain production, which broadly recovered, milk production remained depressed until 1331 and oscillated afterwards. This meant many diets lacked protein for years after the famine. William C. Jordan suggested these privations meant many adults alive when the plague first hit had poorly developed immune systems. This could explain the severity of symptoms in the mid-14th century. A post-mortem of bubonic plague victims in the East in 1900 revealed even when only one region of the body displayed a bubo, nearly all the glands in the body were inflamed. Edema and swelling could spread to incorporate the chest. It is possible inflamed glands and other swellings were much more apparent on relatively emasticated victims in the 14th century with ill-functioning immune systems. Although buboes in non-glandular areas during modern plagues are uncommon, the Indian Medical Gazette reported in 1905 they were more likely to develop in children. This could support the view that adults in the 14th century suffered these symptoms as their immune system had similarly not matured. The problem with alternative theories is that they struggle to provide examples of other diseases in which buboes are a regular feature. Benedicto highlighted bubonic plague derives its name from the fact it is the only disease where buboes are expected to form in most cases. This is because the disease enters the body via flea bites, therefore getting quickly drawn into the lymph nodes, allowing time for the lymph nodes to swell. Theories of person-to-person transmission rely on droplets passing in the air, which typically means, in many cases, the lymph nodes are not an early point of infection. Scott and Duncan's proposal that the plague was a hemorrhagic disease, similar to filoviruses like Ebola, is flawed. While diseases like Ebola do infect the lymph system, causing depletion and necrosis in the lymph nodes, thymus, and spleen, the virus does not cause an inflammatory response by the cells in the lymph node itself. Therefore, buboes are unlikely to form. Twigg proposed that anthrax was the causative agent, but large buboes are not a typical symptom of anthrax either. Cohn, like other alternative theorists, questioned whether rats and their fleas were capable of the widespread transmission of the second pandemic. Scott and Duncan claimed that the black rat could not be responsible for the transmission of the Black Death due to climatic factors at the time. David E. Davis maintained that black rat populations in northern Europe were sparse or non-existent and depended upon towns to survive, unlike the brown rat which populates Europe today, which displaced the black rat from the 1500s due to its greater adaptability. These assertions are largely based on analysis of modern black rat populations, mainly located in tropical regions like India and southern China. Benedicto criticized Davis's argument for looking anachronistically into the past. Benedicto emphasized how high reproductivity speeds up the process of natural selection within rat and flea populations, allowing them to adapt to their surroundings. In fact, Mediterranean black rats are different, as they have only 38 chromosomes compared to those in Southeast Asia, which have 42 chromosomes. A black rat population recently lived independently from humans, enduring cold weather in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. Their extermination in 2018 links to what Benedicto labelled modern man's very hostile attitude towards rats in their habitations, making direct comparison to historical black rat populations unsuitable. Skeletal remains of black rats dating from the Middle Ages have been found across Europe, including in Russia and Germany. In Scandinavia, remains have been found in both town and countryside environments, despite its cold climate. The supposed absence of dead rats during the second pandemic is used to deny the presence of Yersinia pestis. Cohn asserted that contemporaries would have witnessed and recorded millions of expired dead rats. Benedicto attacked Cohn for his use of ex silentio argument from silence deductions, as sources not recording an event is not evidence that it did not happen. Cohn is imposing a modern understanding of plague to the past by speculating that chroniclers would have recognized the significance of dead rats like doctors do now in the present day. Likewise, John Aperth called Cohn's claim the product of fantasy, which did not align with accounts from the third pandemic either. Twigg's argument that mass rat death was a fact well known and commented upon by people in endemic bubonic plague areas during modern plague outbreaks is unsubstantiated. Benedicto shows that Twigg, along with Scott and Duncan, are over-reliant on evidence from a South African town where perhaps many barrowloads of dead rats were noticed on the streets. Observers of the plague in Belgium during 1908 to 1909 wrote that rats frequently die in their burrows or under cover out of sight. In the case of one plague victim, the presence of dead rats was only denoted by maggots dropping from the roof. Through catching methods, they found that the rat population had decreased. The number of seriously infected rats caught was lower than the human rate of infection because of the difficulty in obtaining dying rats. Observing the plague in India, Bannerman blamed the double floors of houses, which provided a cavity for rats to breed in unseen. After removing floor tiles, numerous dead rats were found within the space hidden between the floors. Similarly, while recording the deaths of domesticated animals living with people during the Black Death, Nicephorus Gregoras, a Byzantine astronomer, noted that even the rats that happened to live within the walls of houses died. Benedicto cited Gregoras as one example of the fact that dead rats were mentioned during the Black Death, but only as a sideshow to the death of other animals, according to the theory of miasma. Miasma theory held that poisonous air caused plague, affecting everything. Accompanying mass mortality of humans was that of animals. This was most profound in England, where during 1348 to 1349, huge numbers of sheep died. In Florence, domesticated animals like dogs died, with plague rebirth. In Uzbekistan, camels, lions, and wild boar died. These animals had more immediate importance to human society than rats, so it is not surprising dying rats are only mentioned in passing or omitted entirely. Contrastingly, much examination of the third pandemic took place after the discovery of Yersinia pestis in 1894, and the hypothesis that rats and their fleas transmitted the disease. Therefore, the deaths of rats in the third pandemic took on a new significance, whereby rats were privileged over other animals. Notably, dedicated rat-catching staff were employed in Belgaum during 1908 to 1909. During their inquiry, the scientists faced an uncooperative local population who did not tie much significance to the death of rats. Likewise, chroniclers of the Middle Ages had no reason to attach any significance to the death of rats as well during the second pandemic. Critics of the traditional view commonly hold the Black Death spread too fast for it to be bubonic plague. The Black Death typically had a period of 3 to 5 days between exhibiting symptoms and death. The bubonic plague has a short incubation period of 2 to 6 days before this. This means that most victims of the bubonic plague die before they could travel far, potentially slowing its spread. Additionally, as was evident in the 20th century, the bubonic plague was rarely passed from person to person. Such transmission is possible with a Yersinia pestis infection when it causes pneumonic plague only, but not bubonic. In pneumonic form, droplets, including blood, are coughed out, infecting others via the air. Carlson argues that an alleged outbreak of plague in 15th century Iceland proves that the Black Death and later outbreaks could spread in a primary pneumonic form. Carlson cites authors from the 17th century who testify the absence of rats. Carlson's argument is flawed, as the pneumonic form of plague is not as contagious as it seems, and it is not usually transmitted more than 3 times after the first infection. Additionally, at the time of 1402 to 1404, no parts of Europe that had outbreaks regularly shipped to Iceland, and Carlson's translation of sources was problematic. Therefore, Benedicto concludes that Iceland experienced an unrelated outbreak different to the general plague. Alternatively, Scott and Duncan propose that the plague must have been a viral hemorrhagic disease with a long incubation period of up to 21 days. This way, asymptomatic carriers could spread the disease over long sea voyages throughout Europe, unlike someone infected with the bubonic plague, who they claim would have died beforehand. However, this view is based on the erroneous interpretation that bubonic plague only travels through adjoining rat colonies, ignoring the significant role of metastatic transmission. The Indian Plague Research Commission found that in 1907, that bubonic plague could travel long distances via infected rat fleas in grain or clothing, giving rise to a rat epizootic in a new distant locality far away. During the second pandemic, the Black Death arrived in Norway, this way via boats, from its active trade with London, which was enduring an outbreak. Likewise, the plague had entered England at the port of Bristol. In most diseases, an increased population density means an increased rate of transmission. However, this was not the case during the Black Death, whereby rural areas, where 90% of the population lived, proved more susceptible to the disease. Henry Knighton wrote in the late 14th century that many villages and hamlets were deserted because everyone who had lived there was dead. This inverse correlation is a characteristic of bubonic plague. This is because, as rats are territorial animals, their colonies are evenly distributed. This means, in villages in the countryside, there is a high ratio of rats to people. Therefore, when a rat epizootic happens, the rat fleas have fewer people to choose from, ensuring a greater proportion of mortality as nearly everyone is infected. Contrastingly, towns had a greater number of dead due to a large number getting infected. However, it is a lower proportion of the overall population that becomes infected compared to the countryside. Therefore, in towns, the morbidity and mortality rate is relatively lower. Other pathogenic causes, such as a virus or anthrax, would not produce this pattern. This goes against the doubts expressed by Twigg over the Black Death's ability to reach so many people in rural locations. Perhaps the strongest evidence tying Yersinia pestis to the plague comes from DNA analysis of skeletons. Stephanie Hensch isolated Yersinia pestis DNA from mass graves dating from the 14th century in England, Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. The sites covered the plague's progression from southern to northern Europe. Likewise, a separate study found Yersinia pestis DNA in the remains of a cemetery dating to the Black Death in Montpellier. Skeletons from later dates, including 133 in Lamsbeck from 1590 and 200 in Marseille, also contained genetic material of Yersinia pestis. The fact that these investigations concerning different geographical locations and time periods come to the same conclusion substantiates the belief that Yersinia pestis was the most common form of plague. In conclusion, the cause of the second pandemic, including the Black Death, was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, primarily in bubonic form. This could be construed from the prevalence of buboes in contemporary reports of symptoms. The occurrence of buboes in most victims is a defining characteristic of bubonic plague, which cannot be accounted for by a viral hemorrhagic disease or by anthrax either. The Black Death's transmission and spread can be accounted for by the activities of rats and their fleas. Attempts to deny this by Cohn, in particular, are anachronistic, as they do not take into account the ability of the black rat and fleas to adapt to their surroundings, as was seen in the Outer Hebrides. Archaeology also provides substantial evidence for the presence of black rats throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, even in areas with a cold climate. The argument that a lack of recorded mass rat deaths during the second pandemic means it was not bubonic plague is fallacious. Firstly, it misrepresents and exaggerates the experiences of rat deaths during the third pandemic, which often happened out of sight. Secondly, it fails to take into account the context of various mass animal deaths during the Middle Ages and a different medieval mindset when it came to recognizing what events were significant. Unlike Scott and Duncan's assertion, the bubonic plague can travel long distances on ships via flea-infested clothing and grain, meaning it fits in with the long-distance spread of plague through ports, which was clearly seen during the second pandemic. Carlson's theory is unlikely due to the limitations of bubonic plague in spreading, and that Iceland appears to have been an isolated epidemic, distinct from the rest of Europe. Importantly, the presence of bubonic plague explains the peculiar pattern of rural deaths in the countryside being higher than in towns. which happens with almost no other disease. This is due to the role of the rat to person ratios in its spread, meaning that per percentage of the population, the countryside had a higher rate of death. Finally, the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA in remains provides empirical evidence that Yersinia pestis was the causative agent. This, alongside contemporary reports of symptoms and how the plague spread, all point towards the plague disease being bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis.